Okay, so we're now going to have our first panel session. Bill, Angus and Karin are all going to present individual papers, probably for about 15 to 20 minutes each-ish. I shall wield the cards of power and try and keep it all in time, but I don't think there'll be any problem with that. And then after everyone's spoken for about 20 minutes, that should leave us with 15 minutes ish for questions and discussion at the end. Shall we kick off then with who's first on the list, Bill?
Yep.
Okay.
So I'm Bill McClanahan. I'm a graduate student at Eastern Kentucky University. I'm working there with Avi Brisman, who I think a lot of you guys know. And what I want to present today is something that kind of came out of some stuff that Avi and I were doing, looking at the criminalisation of environmentally beneficial activities. And we were looking at things like line drawing, hitchhiking, train hopping, and water reuse. And as we got going with it, water reuse was really the thing that got our attention the most. And then we started thinking kind of about issues of access and pollution and how we conceptualize them and kind of divide them. And then we started thinking about how climate change and other factors kind of push the two issues together. So what I'm going to present today is kind of our preliminary look at that. So water pollution, whether it's from point sources such as BP's 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or from non-point sources like quotidian stormwater runoff, constitutes one of the most pressing issues of global ecological health. Meanwhile, inadequate access to safe and sanitary supplies of fresh water causes over 3% of all human deaths worldwide and is the leading cause of death for children under 5 years old, while freshwater animal species face an extinction rate 5 times that of terrestrial animals. Although developing nations bear the brunt of insufficient access to clean water, problems of accessibility are less likely to impact the developed and post-industrial world unless they affect agricultural production or recreation. Droughts that crippled Midwestern U.S. farmers and the closure of unsustainable golf courses each garnered significant media attention in 2012 in the U.S. There seems to be a tendency to conceptualize relevant water issues along the binary lines of access issues and pollution issues. For the most part, we have considered issues of pollution as primarily affecting the first world nations of the global north, while issues of access are framed as primarily relevant to the developing nations of the global south. This tendency within both public and criminological imaginations to divert water issues into one of these two streams, if you'll pardon the pun, has left us blind to the increasing likelihood that with the global adoption of neoliberal logics advocating access-reducing water privatization schemes and the growing effects of climate change, the lines between issues of access and pollution will become increasingly blurred. This blurring will likely occur not only along conceptual lines, but also material ones, as those in the global north face increased water shortages, while those in the global south face increased pollution. With that in mind, I'd like to explore the connections between access and pollution, various responses to these issues, and the potential these responses have to highlight the increasing interconnectedness of water issues. While drought-prone areas in the global north now regularly enact legislation to limit water use, the majority of Americans still have giant conceptual hurdles to leap in understanding and responding to water scarcity. Water scarcity, in the context of an America overflowing with markets selling bottled water, seems almost ridiculous. However, the false perception of abundance and unfettered access that's fostered by the availability and ubiquity of bottled water ultimately contributes to problematic practices relating to issues of both access and pollution. As Brisman and South have noted, the selling of bottled water involves the construction and perpetuation of various myths relating to access to clean water. Consumers within the global north are encouraged, through the languages of marketing and conspicuous consumption, to distrust the water that flows from their taps, water that costs a fraction per liter of bottled water. Water sellers incorporate imagery tailored to evoke traditional notions of water purity, the glacier, the mountain stream, and the natural aquifer, and promote the image of bottled water as an ethical, green, or health-conscious alternative to tap water, while through stringent testing standards, municipal tap water supply systems maintain purity levels significantly higher than those of their bottled competitors. These myths touch the core of American water consciousness in that they appeal to a public increasingly inundated with and concerned about events involving water pollution. The Deepwater well disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, the discovery of large amounts of pharmaceutical compounds in public water supplies in 2008, and the rupture of an Exxon oil pipeline in Arkansas earlier this year have each garnered significant media attention focused primarily on how these events compromise water quality and the health of marine ecosystems. Indeed, the Exxon spill in 1989 still occupies a place in the American public imagination and vernacular as a truly catastrophic event some 15 years later. The willingness, even eagerness of the public to seriously consider these harmful events illustrates the tendency within the global north to consider pollution the most pressing issue relating to water. While water pollution is, of course, an issue of pretty big importance, the tendency within the developed world to give primacy to issues of pollution highlights what we might be missing by failing to consider important emergent issues of water access. Indeed, the reality that water sellers try so stringently to obfuscate is that issues of water access and water pollution are quickly becoming inextricably linked. The catchment, manufacture, transportation, and sale of bottled water, those energy-intensive processes that ultimately coalesce to give the developed world such a mistaken perception of water abundance, is a significant contributor to the global degradation of water quality. Furthermore, as global warming continues apace, it's likely that some regions already affected by drought will be hit even harder, while others may find themselves water-rich. The constantly shifting geographies of water wealth and drought, combined with the increased likelihood of water pollution made possible by the opening of Arctic seas for shipping and oil exploration, and the continuation of harmful consumptive practices, makes it increasingly likely that the boundaries, both conceptual and spatial, between access and pollution will blur further. This blurring will make the exchange of technologies, methods, and logics developed to reduce pollution and combat privatization an imperative for those wishing to ensure access to clean water, as well as those wishing to reduce non-point source pollution. With an eye toward the interconnectedness of these issues, I'd like to explore some various responses to issues of access and pollution. So, in 1998, the government of Bolivia, under the supervision of the World Bank, passed laws that effectively privatized the water supply system of Cochabamba, a region that over 1 million Bolivians call home, 60% of them indigenous. Concessions to manage and profit from the Cochabamba water system were granted to Bechtel, a multi-billion-dollar global engineering and construction corporation. Bechtel, upon taking control of the water supply in Cochabamba, immediately tripled prices and cut off water services to those unable to pay, going so far as to charge for rainwater gathered in homemade and traditional catchment systems. In response, the Coalition in Defense of Life and Water was formed, quickly organizing a referendum that demanded the cancellation of all Bolivian water contracts with Bechtel. When the Bolivian authorities refused to back down, protesters took to the streets and were met with repressive violence from the state military, leaving dozens wounded and one 17-year-old protester dead. The Bolivian government eventually capitulated and severed all contracts with Bechtel. Prior to the '98 agreement between Bechtel and Bolivia, Bolivian authorities had granted water concessions to other international interests. In 1997, again under pressure from the World Bank, the water supply system of La Paz, a major city and governmental hub of more than 2 million residents, was sold off to multinational French water giant Suez. Suez immediately violated their agreement with Bolivia, overcharging dramatically for water connections and use, providing selectively to the wealthy and urbane residents of La Paz, while failing to improve infrastructure and water quality. Throughout the El Alto region, the hilly landscape surrounding metropolitan La Paz and home to the bulk of the region's indigenous people, a fierce resistance to Suez's control of water broke out. General strikes in January of 2005 crippled the cities of El Alto and ground business to a halt, leading eventually to the ousting of two presidents, De Lozada and Mesa. Their successor, Evo Morales, handily became the first indigenous leader in Bolivia's history. In January of 2007, Morales and Bolivia celebrated the final removal of Suez and the return of public water control to El Alto and La Paz. Morales defined the issue of the day with a simple statement: water cannot be turned over to a private business. Corporate capture of water supply systems in the name of neoliberal privatization constitutes, then, a significant blow to those wishing to ensure access to water. Not only does water privatization raise consumer costs to outrageous levels that make adequate access difficult, but privatized water systems, particularly those in nations that still have developing infrastructure and oversight, have a fairly abysmal track record when it comes to their provision of sanitary water, and that's attributable to profit motivations gaining primacy over water purity motivations. Through this lens, the activist response in those regions targeted for privatization is concerned primarily with issues of access and secondarily with issues of pollution. Meanwhile, responses to water issues in the global north highlight the primacy of pollution concerns. Concerned about the environmentally deleterious effects of wasteful and polluting American water habitus, green-minded North American water warriors advocate changes in technology and practice that aim to correct harmful errors in human interactions with the water cycle. Promoting reuse systems such as gray water recycling, catchment and storage systems such as homemade, do-it-yourself cisterns and holding ponds, and ecologically friendly and beneficial systems like the composting toilet and the rain barrel, the water warriors of the United States face their own challenges from a political and regulatory system that increasingly favors state corporate management of water. Because of the ease in which DUI water reuse can be contextualized as inherently resistant to consumer capitalist order, efforts to criminalize it are nearly inevitable. Other forms of DIY reuse, such as dumpster diving for food and scavenging for discarded building materials, have been criminalized, and those who engage in such practices are increasingly socially marginalized as their lifestyles bump up against the demands made by consumer culture. The tendency of the state to work to protect the interests of capital by criminalizing many of the activities under the do-it-yourself, conservation, and reuse umbrella lays plain the state's perceived mandate to act as the protector of corporate interests rather than a guardian of water purity. Regulatory efforts to effectively criminalize gray water use take the form of a Byzantine regulatory framework with codes and regulations stretching across homeowner associations, municipalities, cities, counties, and states. According to a report authored by Art Ludwig of California's Oasis Design, that's a group that designs commercial and residential gray water reuse systems, quote, "There are literally thousands of different gray water regulatory authorities, every state, county, and city, and no one knows how many of them are regulating gray water independently or what exactly they're doing," unquote. This atmosphere of multi-level regulatory confusion makes it exceedingly difficult to untangle the web of regulatory controls placed on gray water reuse, not only for those wishing to implement reuse systems, but also for those attempting to study and map the regulatory history and landscape. It's clear, though, that anyone considering gray water implementation in the United States runs the risk of violating various regulatory codes, as evidenced by Ludwig's introductory warning in that same book that, quote, "the design and use of gray water systems can carry legal consequences," unquote. While the water justice movements of the global South and those of the global North are very different, each response is illustrative of a truly global water consciousness concerned with the myriad ways in which the privatization of water, the removal of community-based controls on water supplies, and the criminalization of sustainable water practices and technologies jeopardize not only water access, but global water quality itself. Activists in the global South, while currently concerned primarily with issues of inadequate access relating to privatization efforts, are increasingly likely to bear the brunt of water pollution, which is fueled significantly by the problematic water habitus of the developed nations of the global North. In turn, water-conscious activists in the global North currently focus their attention on issues of pollution, although they are likely to find themselves up against many of the same issues of access currently prioritized in the global South. Indeed, American activists concerned with water are already turning their attention to access issues. In Gray Water, The Next Wave, a book that's primarily a design guide that's free of the explicitly political content that characterizes a lot of American water activism, Curtis McClanahan briefly expresses the access issues motivating his own implementation of gray water reuse. Reflecting concerns over a coming global water shortage, McClanahan urges the use of gray water systems to deal with, quote, "water shortages and restrictions that can only get worse." Here, McClanahan illustrates the willingness of the global North to consider issues of access alongside issues of pollution and to tailor responses accordingly. The other side of the coin, the willingness of those active in the global South to consider issues of pollution alongside issues of access, is illustrated by author and water activist Vandana Shiva, writing that, quote, "more than anything, the oil economy's environmental externalities, such as pollution and climate change, will determine the future of water, and through the future of water, the future of all life," unquote. This recognition and exchange of concerns between the developed and developing worlds draws attention to the merging issues of access and issues of pollution. As climate change continues to advance, its impact on water issues, whether they're issues of pollution or access, can only increase. Because it's such a profoundly global phenomenon, the impact of climate change on water access and pollution provides a unique opportunity for various criminologies to consider water as a global, conceptual, and material site worthy of examination. As Agnew and others have noted, climate change is certain to have serious criminogenic effects relating to mass migration and displacement, increased strain, resource conflict, and offender opportunity. Kramer and others have suggested that criminologists conceptualize climate change as state corporate crime, Adoption of that conceptual framework leads us almost inevitably to consider harmful water privatization schemes and regulatory repression of healthy water habitats as criminogenic. With conflicts stemming from both issues, access and pollution, becoming increasingly likely, criminological and public imaginations would do well to consider these issues in tandem rather than continuing to draw conceptual lines between the two. There you go.
Thank you, Bill. The whole questions until the end progress down the list as Bill, I think. So, Angus, do you want to
pull my USB out?
I'll leave it in.
Okay.
Works, yes, and ignore the possibility of zapping Bill with harmful radiation.
I'll make it.
Okay, this is in part a work in progress because it deals with a couple of different areas. One of the things that we've heard already today is about the difficulties of taking enforcement action against multinational corporations. What I'm looking at in part is the activities of oil companies in Nigeria, and particularly here I'm focusing on one case study involving Royal Dutch Shell. I'll just call them Shell from now on, just for safety's sake. Okay. And part of my interest is in how you deal with the activities of oil companies and corporate environmental crime, particularly in relation to the fact that the majority of enforcement action is ineffective and is based on the idea of settling cases rather than actually dealing with them through prosecution. Now, there are two aspects to the work in progress here. One is in relation to a particular legal case, which I will talk about, but I'm actually looking at the criminological aspects of the case. Okay, so, and of the behaviour of the oil companies. Okay, so, just to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to read a little bit from a Friends of the Earth report. The oil industry has an enormous physical presence in the environmentally sensitive, highly populated Niger Delta of Nigeria. Throughout 50 years of oil production, this ecologically productive region has suffered extensive habitat degradation, forest clearing, toxic discharges, dredging and filling, and significant alteration by extensive road and pipeline construction from the petroleum industry. Of particular concern in the Niger Delta are the frequent and extensive oil spills that have occurred. Spills are underreported, but independent estimates are that at least 115,000 barrels, 15,000 tonnes, of oil on average are spilled in the Delta each year, making the Niger Delta one of the most oil-impacted ecosystems in the world. Okay, so what we are talking about is a legal industry, oil extraction, which has an endemic problem of oil spills attached to it. Now, whether you view those oil spills as being criminal behaviour, I do, I'm off the fence, or whether you view them, as we've heard earlier on, often they are simply described as accidents. But, 250 spills a year on average, and a consistent period of spills over a 50-year period, more than the Deepwater Horizon, that's an awful lot of accidents to be occurring. Okay, so that's the basics. And essentially what we're talking about here is we're talking about an environmental justice problem where Western corporations are having a negative impact on an indigenous population. Okay, so what the oil exploration has tended to do is to result in some of these problems: oil spills and gas flaring, contamination of the local environment and the resultant impact on fishing, inadequate clean-up. They accept that oil spills occur, and as we've heard earlier on today, there are mechanisms in place for dealing with it. There are mechanisms in place for dealing with the oil spills, there are mechanisms in place for dealing with the fallout in all its various forms, including the possibility of prosecution, although as I'm going to show as we go on, prosecution tends to happen relatively rarely, and in fact, in most cases, where it involves a large corporation, the remedy is left to the community to try and deal with it through civil means. Okay, so that's a significant problem because you are relying on vulnerable and marginalised communities to effectively take their own legal action in order to deal with the harm. And one of the things that I'm interested in and I've been looking at in this particular case is the role of NGOs as enforcers and the role of NGOs in facilitating environmental justice for communities that don't necessarily have access to legal means themselves. Okay, so, and the other thing, the bottom one, is the consequence of the oil spills is that the drinking water has become polluted in Nigeria, and also fishing and farming, which is what the communities rely on, has become almost unsustainable, so their livelihoods are being destroyed. And the long-term consequence of that is a lowering of life expectancy. So particularly in the Ogoniland area, it's now under 50 years. Okay, so that is your life expectancy is similar to the life expectancy of Victorian England when we were sending children up chimneys and all that kind of thing. So it's quite a serious effect. Now, just to give you a little bit of background on Nigerian law. Nigerian law basically requires good oil field practice to American standards. So it's internationally accepted standards that you have safety mechanisms in place, but also there is a requirement if there is an oil spill, you clean it up as soon as is possible. The idea is that you should be trying to do it within about 24 hours, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. It actually means that you take action within 24 hours. And as we will discover, what that action is and how effective that action is subject to debate. Okay, now, I'm delighted that Judith mentioned civil penalties and settlement having lost their stigma. I'm not delighted that that's the case, I'm delighted that that was mentioned. But also, corporate reputation management was mentioned earlier on as well. That's one of the issues that I'm looking at. How do you enforce good standards of corporate environmental responsibility when nobody can agree on what they are? Okay, so what you have is you have a CSR or CER landscape. Corporations claim to act responsibly and claim to act in a sustainable way. This is particularly important in the oil industry because many of the major corporations who are responsible for environmental damage, if you look at their corporate environmental responsibility reports and their corporate sustainability reports, they will claim and attempt to demonstrate that they operate in an environmentally responsible way. Okay? I'll try not to name too many oil companies, but in looking at this, many of them have environmental sustainability reports that suggest that corporate environmental responsibility is at the core of their business. Okay? Keep that figure of 250 oil spills a year in your mind as I say this. Okay, now, the reasons why they do this, there are a variety of different reasons for doing it, and Harris has put together these three things. One, acting ethically is the right way for the company to behave. Two, doing what is right and fair is what's expected of the organisation. And three, acting ethically is in the organisation's best interests. However, the extent to which any one of those or a combination of those operates within a corporation varies wildly. So that in some cases, environmental responsibility is effectively just a brand tool. It's part of their reputation management. So in the event of a prosecution or in the event of a claim of damage, they go, no, we have all these measures in place so that we can demonstrate that we are acting responsibly. Okay, and in some cases, it's dealt with at a relatively low level within the organisation. Okay. However, it is largely a voluntary and self-regulatory system. So it's up to the organisation itself to decide how they implement their environmental responsibilities. Whether that is doing basics that legislation requires, or whether they're going to go beyond basic compliance and integrate it into the whole way that the organisation operates. So you can have a situation where, in fact, a corporation has all the right policies, but yet things are still going wrong in a way that mean that they are I'll say criminally negligent for now, and I may backtrack on that slightly later on. Okay, but the problem is, because this is not necessarily something that is enforced in any particular way, and there are not necessarily any concrete standards that people have to abide by, there's often a difference of opinion between the NGOs and corporations between what is needed, and even the community and the corporation between what they have to do to comply with the law and act in an environmentally responsible way, especially when what you are talking about is not necessarily that the organisation has been deliberately criminally negligent, but with oil companies, as I sort of outlined earlier on, oil spills seem to be an endemic part of the business. Okay, so they seem to be surprisingly frequent. Okay, so there's a particular case which illustrates some of the things that I've been looking at and the failures of corporations to prevent what are effectively criminal acts. One case I'm going to talk about in particular relates to 3 oil spills that took place from a leaking pipeline, 2004 to 2007, the 3 spills we're talking about. Now, I should say that this is not a picture of one of the particular spills. This is just a freely available picture of oil spills that take place in Nigeria, of which there are many. But we're talking about 3 particular spills here: 2004, 2005, and 2007. Okay, now for the students among us, some theoretical considerations. Okay, so what we're talking about in relation to the environmental justice issues is impact and marginalisation of an indigenous community. People who rely on the land for fishing and farming are the victims of the behaviour of Western company. We also have an ecological justice issue, wider environmental harm. So although we're talking about spills that occur in a particular area, there's a wider impact on the environment in Nigeria, the water supply and so on. Okay, there's also an environmental injustice issue. Okay. Law breaking around pollution and misuse of resources. Remembering that Nigerian law requires that you operate in the best possible way, that you maintain standards, and that where there are spills, you clean them up. So photographs like the one I've just shown you should not be occurring. Okay. And then there's the species justice issue. Okay. Destruction of non-sustainable habitats, failure to address the needs of other species. It's not just pollution of the water, it's the ecosystem that relies on that water and those resources. And then there are particular corporate crime concerns. Okay, so there is a failure of corporate environmental responsibility, and in fact, corporations claiming to be acting in a responsible way are still damaging the environment. Okay, there's also what's called constructive and creative compliance. Okay, so you have corporations that have policies in place, and yet somehow these accidents are still occurring on a frequent basis. Okay, and it's a crime of the powerful. If you are going to attempt to take them, a large Western oil company to court, it's quite difficult. Okay, in relation to the communities, it's quite difficult for them to have access to legal resources. I've got a little bit about that on the next slide, but I'm going to spin over it, noting Matthew's cards of doom. And arguably, there is a culture of non-compliance. In looking at these conjoined cases, one of the things that I've noticed in looking through the legal documents is the total denial of responsibility and the "it's not our fault" approach. And I'll come on to that in a moment. Okay, so, and also in relation to that, as we've heard earlier on today, a number of neutralisation techniques come into play. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so, here is a legal case relating, to these 3 oil spills. And what I should say is that it's a civil case, okay, because it wasn't possible to pursue this properly through criminal means. So this is a civil case. It's a class action. Okay, so it's effectively 4 Nigerian farmers who've had their properties damaged and their livelihoods destroyed, together with an NGO bringing a class action. Okay, so it's one case effectively involving the 3 or 4 oil spills. Now, class actions are a good way of dealing with a problem and saying, look, you haven't just affected one individual, you've affected several others, and in this case you have also damaged the environment. Class actions are more common in America than they are over here. It's actually quite difficult to bring a class action under English law for reasons I'm not going to go into, but I'll be around later on if anybody wants to grill me on it. Sadly, I know more about this than is healthy for me. But this is the claim. It's a claim that Shell Nigeria failed in its duty of care standards by failing to carry out required maintenance, didn't replace the pipeline in time, didn't take measures to suspend the oil flow after the spill, and didn't clean it up in a timely manner or completely clean it up. Okay, now in addition to that, there is a claim made against the parent company, Royal Dutch Shell, because they failed to ensure that their subsidiary extracts oil in Nigeria in a careful way. Okay, that's quite important because one of the things that happens in corporate environmental crime quite a lot is that the Western parent company blames their developing world subsidiary. Basically, it's down to the other corporation, it's nothing to do with us. If they just did everything we told them to and followed our corporate guidelines, everything would be fine, these things wouldn't happen. Okay. So, Shell's position was, we're not responsible for the actions of our Nigerian subsidiary. In addition to that, the damage took place in Nigeria relates to alleged losses occurring in Nigeria, and it's solely a matter that should be dealt with in Nigeria. That was their argument. Okay, so it's a local issue rather than a wider environmental problem that we should be dealing with. And then, consistent with some of the things we've already heard today, it's not that actually there was any fault on our part. This was all down to sabotage. Okay, so it's either an accident or somebody broke our pipeline. You know, pick one of the two, or both, we'll run with either. And in fact, if you read the documents, they attempt to partially run both arguments. Okay, they also argue that they acted quickly before, during and after the event, and also then they blame the community, saying that they couldn't get access to the pipeline to deal with things quickly because the local village was obstructing them. Okay, so if we think about our techniques of neutralisation, a number of them are there. They're blaming the victim, they're challenging the legitimacy of the prosecutor. It's an NGO involved, so they actually start to make an argument that the NGO is doing this for a wider issue rather than dealing with the local problem. They deny responsibility, it's sabotage. They deny the harm, it's a local issue, it's a relatively small thing, it's not a big environmental concern, why can't we all just get along? And then they attempt to challenge the jurisdiction of the Dutch court. So in effect they're saying, you should not prosecute the parent company, we should not have a court action in Europe for something that happened in Nigeria. They're almost saying, go after our Nigerian subsidiary, that's fine. Okay, so, very, very quickly, I'm going to talk about the judgments now. I understand that appeals are pending, but the problem here is that the case was brought by Friends of the Earth in the Netherlands and their sister organisation in Nigeria on behalf of the 4 farmers. Okay. Now, to cut a long story short, the claims against the parent company effectively failed. Okay. But the court was able to reach a judgment in relation to Shell Nigeria. So in effect what they said was, even though it was sabotage, you didn't put steps in place to prevent that sabotage from taking place, so you should pay prosecution. Now, compensation. Now I gather the compensation amount, it has to be determined, I think it's subject to appeal, but that's quite important, I think, because what it does a couple of things. First of all, it bolsters the idea that action can be taken against subsidiary companies and parent companies. So even though it failed in this case, the Dutch court actually heard the case. Okay, and that's quite important. Now, something similar happens, I'm prepared to be corrected by our American colleagues, but I believe the US Alien Tort Act allows something similar. so that American companies can be prosecuted for things they do abroad. It doesn't always work, but that's one of the ideas that I think is quite important about this case. So, for an NGO to be able to address the wider environmental damage issues by looking at the actions of the parent company and the subsidiary company is worth trying, particularly where there are problems in the developing world company with bringing a legal action, because the people affected have difficulty in actually mounting a legal action. Okay, if you can join the two cases together, the two issues together, the actions of the parent company, the actions on the ground, bring a case in European or American country or American jurisdiction, that allows NGOs to actually act on behalf of people and bring class actions where it's possible. That's quite important because in a lot of the communities that are suffering directly from the actions of oil companies, they have no chance of bringing a legal action in the host country. And one of the other things I would just mention, and I think I have a minute left, is in relation to the corporate environmental responsibility activities, at the moment it's all voluntary. However, there is scope to prosecute corporations for making environmental claims that are then held to be unfounded. And that's something that I'm looking into at the moment. There are, in the sort of written version of this, there are cases in America involving Walmart's the one I can remember, and there's another corporation who made certain sustainability claims that were then proved to be unfounded, and litigation took place on the grounds that they had misled consumers. Okay, so that's something. Part of what I'm arguing for is that corporate environmental responsibility should be enforceable, but if you can't enforce the criminal behaviour, one of the things that you can do is take litigation through the civil courts, and I think that potentially becomes quite powerful. And I will stop there before Matthew gives me the finger again.
Brilliant, thank you, Angus. Karin?
Yes, thank you. My name is Karin from Wingerde. I'm an assistant professor of criminology at Erasmus School of Law, University of Rotterdam. And today I'd like to share some of the results of my PhD, which I finished last year and which focused on the general deterrent effect of sanctions on the behavior of firms in the waste industry in the Netherlands. And the starting point of my study was actually, again, the disaster with the Provocoale in the summer of 2006, and Judith already described the case in her presentation, so I'm not going to do that again, and I think that these pictures speak for themselves. But I'm going to say something about the reactions to this disaster, because in the aftermath of this case, the European Commission called for intensified controls for waste shipments and more severe penalties for environmental violations. And this eventually resulted in a new directive compelling the member states of the European Union to enforce environmental violations by means of criminal law. And the underlying assumption that was posited was that imposing severe penalties sends a threat message to other firms as well and deters them from non-compliant behavior in the future. And this reaction illustrates how society deals with scandals and cases of corporate misconduct more in general. We see a strong public demand for increased supervision and harsher, more deterrent sanctions based on the belief that the more severe the penalty, the more effectively it will deter companies from breaking the law. And my study addresses this assumption and focuses on how and to what extent the threat of sanctions motivates firms in the waste industry to comply with environmental regulations. And secondly, I also wanted to understand how important deterrence is compared to other forms of regulation, namely social license pressures and management-based regulation. Well, to answer these questions, I've conducted a qualitative empirical study among 40 companies in the waste industry in the Netherlands. And the empirical design consists mostly of interviews with environmental managers, directors, both public and private regulators of these firms. I've conducted observations at those firms, and the results from the interviews and the observations were later confronted with the analysis of many documents, such as annual reports, inspection results, and also legal and environmental licenses. And I also looked at the media coverage of all these firms. So the starting point of my study was the question, how and to what extent does the threat of sanctions motivate firms to comply with the law? And if we look at deterrence, it assumes that companies are amoral, rational actors that will only comply with the law if it is economically sensible to do so. So only if the costs of criminal behavior in terms of the risks of getting caught and the type and size of the penalty imposed exceed the benefits, then they will comply with the law, and vice versa. And this theory assumes that each sanction sends a threat message that communicates the potential risks of criminal behavior, and as the perceived risks and costs thereby increase, companies will comply with the law. And this means that there are 3 conditions in order for deterrence to work. And the first is that if a sanction is imposed to a company, other companies need to learn about it as well, because if they don't know about the sanctions, it is not likely that they will be deterred by it. And secondly, if they learn about a sanction against one company, they actually need to fear possible consequences in terms of being detected and being punished. Because again, if they don't fear the consequences, it is not likely that they will translate a sanction into new behavior. And finally, in response to hearing about sanctions, firms actually need to take compliance measures in order to make sure that they're not in violation and improve their behavior. And I studied this process, this communication process, or these 3 steps, by asking my interviewees to respond to 2 actual cases, to study their knowledge and also reactions to these sanctions. And I distinguished between a criminal and an administrative case, a regulatory case, to see whether the deterrent effect also depends on the type of the penalty imposed. Well, my study showed that sanctions didn't have much effect in terms of the awareness that they created. Most of the environmental managers simply claimed not to know about these sanctions against their companies. And when looking at the 2 cases, it appeared that they recognized the criminal case much better than the regulatory case, which as such is not so surprising, since criminal cases tend to receive a lot of more attention in the media. But more importantly, although I had asked them to describe the sanctions that they remembered, they spoke about the cases more in general. So they didn't remember the sanction, but they remembered what had happened in incidents leading up to the penalty. For example, in the criminal case, there was a huge fire that caused a lot of damage to the local surroundings, and most of my respondents remembered the fire and its consequences in terms of pollution, but only 2 of them knew that both the company and its 3 executives were criminally prosecuted and convicted, which is quite rare in the Netherlands. And one of my respondents said, well, in order to change your behavior, not the penalty itself is important, but eventually you need to know what happened. And the first explanation for these findings is that the sanctions only provide for a very weak signal and therefore impose only a weak threat on firms. And most of the interviewees believed that penalties for environmental violations are nothing compared to the profits of most of those firms. And they described them in terms of it's a joke or something purely symbolic. But more importantly, they also believed that many sanctions were imposed for violations that are either administrative or quite technical in nature. And the problem with those types of violations is that they simply don't have the same moral meaning as, for example, dumping toxins in the ocean. And being punished for it doesn't involve the same loss of face. In fact, they described or characterized these violations as trivial or insignificant, and this undermines the potential deterrent effect the sanction may have. But a second explanation is that the sanction itself, the penalty itself, and the public regulator that imposes it is simply don't have an important position on the corporate horizon. And during the interviews, there were many examples or illustrations of the importance of private pressures. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. Next to governments, public interest groups, NGOs, local communities, and also the media have also pressured firms to reduce the adverse consequences of their activities. And many environmental managers I interviewed spoke about the importance of having a good relationship with their neighbors and about maintaining their social license. And you can imagine that firms that have a good relationship and a good reputation with their local community also gain the trust and legitimacy of their social environment. And this could make it more easy to recruit well-trained employees or to renew the firm's environmental license. But the same also is true for the opposite. Firms that lack the trust and legitimacy of their local community may be confronted with negative publicity, reputational damages, and even protests. And these are pictures of a large protest against a new waste incinerator in the Netherlands a couple of years ago. And the upper left picture, it says waste no. And the picture of the little boy, the sign says, I'd like to stay healthy as well. So you can imagine how this, how firms react to this, because this is, these protests and this negative publicity, it is their biggest fear. So not the sanction itself, but negative publicity that results in reputational damages and pressure from especially their local community is far more threatening than the risk of legal sanctions. And, reputation therefore can be a powerful influence to compliance, and it may sometimes even lead to beyond compliance behavior. And I've seen some examples of that as well. For example, the last quote is from a company that hired two smelling experts, two people who drive through the area twice a day trying to locate any smells coming from the incinerator of the company. And this is something that is not compelled by regulations, but it did help to improve their relationship with the public. And there were many more of such examples. For instance, there was another company that already obtained a legal license for mobile installation for the demolition of construction waste. Those installations tend to produce a lot of noise and dust. And in the process of obtaining the license, the local community had expressed their concerns. And the company decided after obtaining the license not to effectuate it because of its relationship with the public, so they didn't use it. To sum up, as far as sanctions influence the behavior of these firms, this effect runs through the social environment. So negative publicity again and reputational damages are more threatening than the risk of legal sanctions. Of course, the degree to which sanctions actually penetrate the business environment also depends on the responsibility within the firm to comply with the law. And a key concept in this regard is the social responsiveness of the firm, which refers to the firm's ability to take into account the negative consequences of its actions and actually respond to the demands and expectations of the regulatory and social environment. And you can imagine that the more responsive the firm is, the sooner it views a sanction as a signal to check whether it still operates in compliance with the law, and if not, take actions to improve its behavior. But my research at the same time shows that more responsive firms are also often large and complex organizations that will not always view a sanction itself as a meaningful suggestion to compliance. And this is because the sanction itself usually only communicates the fact that a violation has occurred, but it does not provide information on the causes of the incident or the blameworthiness of the offense. And well, those two aspects are, I think, crucial to actually improve their behavior. And well, one of my respondents said, well, in fact, it is important to create a culture of compliance in which you constantly monitor your own behavior and actually improve it. But he wasn't sure a sanction would help him do that. So let me put things into perspective and say something about the character of the waste industry in the Netherlands. Because nowadays it is an important economic branch of industry with large, often international organizations that seek for high-level innovations in terms of environmental performance. But this wasn't always the case. The waste industry developed rapidly in the 70s and 80s when, due to new environmental regulations, the treatment and processing of waste became very profitable. And this attracted many businessmen who tried to make it in this industry. But as you can imagine, also many businessmen who were less inclined to properly handle the waste. And this resulted in the 80s and 90s in several huge environmental scandals in this industry. And in reaction to these scandals, a regulatory climate has emerged in which waste companies were met with tight regulatory pressures and more severe penalties.
Again, in the UK, which Angus knows about, so you've got all these gamekeepers in the shooting industry. At the moment, if a water is caught poisoning as a prey, it's their fault, not the head gamekeeper. In Scotland, that's not changed, so it's now kind of the head gamekeepers are now going to get prosecuted for it, even if it's the member of staff doing it. So it's a possibility. I assume that it would be a lot more difficult with corporations. Wouldn't that be possible to try and introduce this idea of vicarious liability so that the Dutch shell, the big shell will get prosecuted, no matter what, if it's Nigeria or
Yeah, and I think that's the point that you were making about norms, because I think what will hopefully happen, or what could possibly happen, whether it will just happen as a result of this case, I don't know, is you could end up with a sort of norm in customary international law where you, instead of just taking action in the subsidiary company, you start to go after the parent company, so that you hopefully you effectively develop a principle of vicarious liability through international law, which says if your subsidiary company does something, particularly if it's something that appears to be against your stated corporate environmental responsibility and CSR policies, you are responsible for not monitoring what they have done, and you are also ultimately responsible. And I think that's one of the attempts that was trying to be made with this case. And I think if enough cases are taking along those lines, then yes, I think that's almost the ideal, that what you then do is you routinely go after both corporations.
And could NGOs help with that process?
Yes. I mean, what I think was important about this case is it was an NGO bringing a class action, effectively, that allowed... Now, there are all sorts of problems with NGOs bringing cases, and the difficulty is that it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to whether or not, as an NGO, you can actually bring a class action. As I said, somewhere in there, bringing a class action in the UK is actually very, very difficult, just because the way our legal system works is actually quite difficult. Other countries it's a little bit easier, but yes, and I think almost you can't do it without an NGO unless one of your affected persons is very clued up on the law. And I think that's the difficulty. You know, there are some countries where access to legal assistance and watching my words again, but you know, I can't imagine anybody bringing a class action in the Caribbean, for example. That would be quite difficult. You know, but it's possible, but difficult. But so I think you do rely on NGOs, and what you would hope is that this becomes the norm. NGOs are able to assist communities in bringing cases where several members of the community are affected, but they're not able to bring the case themselves.
Thank you. Gosh, well, I think that's promised some great discussion to take on into London. Oh, great. Cool. Okay, shall I give all our speakers another
Well done.
Yeah.